So what we're going to have for today is we're going to use the equity buckets function to try and improve our understanding of ranges and how ranges are supposed to play. Okay. You're going to see that as you mature as a player, strategies that you should play are just basically a function of mostly the equity distribution of your range. So what are the different hands you have in your range? What's the equity of those hands? And based on that, you can derive how you should play. Of course, there are going to be other variables that are important, such as SPR and position being the most important ones. But the first step is knowing your range and knowing your opponent's range, right? So if you know exactly what your range looks like and you know exactly what your opponent's range looks like, then generally it gets much easier to derive how you should play given that distribution. Okay, so today we're going to practice exactly this. We're going to have I screenshotted some different equity distributions based on the equity buckets here from Wizard. And what you guys are going to do is you're going to take a look at that equity distribution from the equity buckets, and you're going to have to answer a few questions based solely on that information. Okay. So you're going to have to answer based on those equity distributions. What are the bet size used? In this, we're going to consider the out of position player. Okay, so what are the bet sizes that the out of position player should use? What should be the overall betting frequency for that out of position player given that equity distribution? And then you're going to answer who has more equity and who has more EV. Okay. In a second part, I'll also ask you to answer what spot and line do you think this is? Okay, you're going to try to visualize the game tree and see which spot makes the most sense for ranges to be distributed in that particular way. Okay, so we're going to start here with the first example. We're going to have 3 examples. I think that's what we're going to have time to cover. And on those 3 examples, you're going to have equity distribution for out of position player, equity distribution for in position player based on the equity buckets. And you guys are going to have to try and answer these questions. Okay, and hopefully through this, you're going to see how paying attention and understanding how the different equities impact the strategies. This is going to be helpful to you by playing better in game and executing better a certain plan for a certain range. All right. So this was just an example here to show the equity buckets. We're going to start with this first screenshot here that I'm going to put on the screen right now. Okay. I'm not going to tell you what spot this is. I'm not going to tell you what line this is. I'm just going to show you the equity buckets and you're going to try and answer these 4 questions. Okay. And then of course, based on your predictions, we're going to go ahead and later we're going to check those predictions against a solution. And by doing this, we're going to be able to improve our heuristics. Okay, so where did we make a mistake here in our predictions? Where can we improve our understanding to make better predictions in the future? Right, so we're going to start with the first example here. And for the first example, we're going to use the simple equity buckets. And for the remainder of the 2 examples, we're going to use the advanced equity buckets. All right, but this is the first one we're going to have. These are the equity buckets, and these are the questions that we have here. So let's begin. Who can tell me what are the sizes do you think the out of position player should use given this equity distribution? What sizes? Let me type here. First example. What sizings should the out of position player use with this strategy, considering that this is his equity distribution? Gian was very quick on his answer here. Nice. Over bet or check. Let me put the chat here as well for you guys to see. Gian said over bet or check, betting frequency of 30%. We have more EV, not sure about equity. Nice. How comes you get to all these conclusions, my friend Gian? What exactly is going through your mind here? Stewart said large polar and small. What do you mean large polar and small? I'm not sure what do you mean by that. Haven't seen you here as well, Stewart. Maybe this is the first time you're here. Welcome. Nice to have more people here joining the calls. Polar River spot. Okay. So Stuart is already saying that he thinks this is the river. We didn't come to this question yet. Okay, we're gonna answer the second question in a second moment. We're gonna try and understand which spot and line this is. Gian said our range is very polarized, as Stuart says, so we should only use bigger size and add some bluffs. Nice. Daniel said over bet or check, but I think we should bet around 50%. Nice. So almost everyone here understand that this looks like a very polarized distribution for that position player, right? That position player has 33% of the best hands. And the way the buckets work here, best hands are hands with 75% equity or more. And we have 33, but villain only has 10. So we have a very significant advantage on those strong hands. We have way more than villain. And then when it comes to trash hands, we have a lot of those. We have 43% of trash hands, where villain only has 17. So our range is very polarized. We have a lot of good hands and a lot of weak hands. And villain's range is very condensed. He has 73% of his range between 25 and 75% equity. Those are going to be mostly bluff catchers, right? So it's a typical polarized versus bluff catcher situation. So I agree with you guys here that the sizing should be big. If this is an over bet or a smaller bet, we don't necessarily know because we don't know the SPR, right? But I think it has to be a big sizing. If it's a high SPR, it's probably going to be an over bet. If it's a smaller SPR, we're probably just going to go all in or something close to that. Okay, so big sizing for sure, I think at least is the answer here. What about overall betting frequency? Gia went quickly to 30%. What exactly are your assumptions, or what exactly are the heuristics you're using there, my friend, to arrive at 30%? Your friend Daniel here said we should bet around 50%. How are you guys coming up with these numbers? Stuart now said 40. Is there something we can do, or is there any part of the range we can pay more attention to try and derive better this betting frequency? Or do we just guess here? Or do we just try to remember similar spots where we're going to have this range distribution and then try to remember how much we check in those spots? What process should we take here? Vitaly said, I agree with Daniel. Huge nuts advantage gives us opportunity to bet with high frequency. Daniel said 50%. All right. I mainly used experience, but I guess we should look at value to bluff ratio. Nice. Or MID, said Vitaly. What do you mean MID, Vitaly? Mid, you mean mid frequency? Okay, yeah, I guess you meant mid. All right. What do you mean, Gian, by looking at value to bluff ratio? Try to help us walk through your thought process here. How do we look at that, and how does that help us arrive at the betting frequency here for the range? Any ideas here? Calculating how much value we shove and add some bluffs to that frequency to make opponent indifferent. Okay. Stephen said all our best hands 32 plus half our trash 21. Interesting. So what you're saying that, Stephen, half of our trash, why would we take half of our trash? Why exactly are you picking half of your trash there? We have 40% trash, so too much for a high frequency, said Stewart. Okay. Well, you guys are missing a very important point here, which is what street we are in, right? Because our betting frequency is going to depend on exactly what the street we're in here. If we're on the turn, our frequency is going to be different than if we're on the river. So 2-to-1 ratio, maybe on river, said Stephen. Yeah, that would be the case if we're betting for a pot size, right? So if we're betting for a pot size, we're going to want to have 2 value hands for each bluff, or half of a bluff for each value hand, but we don't know what the size we're betting here. We don't know what street we're betting here. But those are good ideas, okay? Those are good ideas because by taking a look at, the sizing that you're going to use, you can have a rough idea of how many bluffs you need to include. And by knowing how many value you have and how many bluffs you have, you know overall what the frequency should be for your range. So I like your guys' ideas there, but we don't necessarily know here whether we are on the turn, whether or we are on the river. I think we can discard that we are on the flop here, right? I don't think we're going to have any situation where out of position players range is going to be super polarized on the flop. So this is probably never going to be a flop situation that has this equity distribution here, but we don't know whether it's turn or river. It could be both, okay? But if it is on the river, I like your guys' answer. Basically, you would take your nut hands. You want to bet with those. Then you're going to want to include some bluffs to balance those value bets. So imagine we're betting for a pot size. Then we would bet 33 plus the half of that, which would be 16. So it would bet around 50%. Okay, so whoever said 50%, if this was a river spot, I think it's a decent estimation. Okay, since we don't know this is river or turn, how much do you guys think we should bet on the turn? How much do you guys think we should bet if this was the turn instead of the river? Let's aside the assumption that this is river. Let's now assume that this is a turn spot. How does that change here, the frequency? Stuart said it goes to 65. Why is that? With bet pot, it's around 65. Nice, 1-to-1 ratio, right? So on the turn, yes, it's true that generally we're gonna have a closer to 1-to-1 value to bluff ratio in order for us to have the necessary amount of bluffs to balance our range on the river, and also the necessary amount of give ups to give villain incentive to bluff catch against us on the turn, okay? So yes, this would be close to 75 if there was no merged component in our range, okay? You guys are missing the fact that there is, even though it's a small, we do have a merged component here in our range. We do have 14% of weak bluff catchers and 10% of medium bluff catchers, right? 10% of our range is hands from 50 to 75% equity. No draw is going to have more than 50% equity, right? So basically, these hands here are weak bluff catchers. Maybe a weak top pair, or maybe a second pair type hand, or maybe a bottom pair that we turn into a bluff, and then now we don't want to bluff anymore. But we do have a merge component to our range here, okay? And villain does have nuts also. So when we do have this merge component, we're also going to have to check these hands here. And because we're going to have to check these hands and we can be threatened by villain to polarize against us, we're going to have to also check a little bit of our strongest hands. It's not going to be much because this threat from villain is not really high, right? He doesn't have all of that many nuts and it doesn't have all that many bluffs. But generally, when we have this merge component, we're going to have to check that also. And some of our strongest hands are going to have to check to find an equilibrium. So I wouldn't go with 65. I wouldn't go with something close to 60% if we are on the turn, okay? Just a small difference because we have to consider we do have this merge component here in our range. But so far, so good. I think you guys have the right ideas. What about equity? Who has more equity here? Gian answered that he answered that EV should be OP, but equity, he was not sure. Who can give me an idea here of how we can estimate who has more equity in this spot? VYT said, strange assumption from the chat that we bet all best hands OP. Nice idea here from our friend VYT. And that's not usually the case, right? When we are out of position, we can't really afford betting all of our best hands out of position, and that's true. But that's because usually we have a very significant merged component in our checking, in our range when we're out of position, and villain can always threaten us with polarization if we check. So the only way to achieve balance is by checking some of our strongest hands. Here's an extreme case where we have very few of those hands, and villain doesn't have too many bluffs and doesn't have too many strong hands as well. So the threat of him putting a lot of big bets into us is not very high. So I don't think we need to have too many of our good hands in our checking range to be balanced. This is going to happen more often when we have more of these hands and villain has more of these and these hands. Okay. Equity should be equally distributed because IP has a lot of good hands. So do you think it's 50-50, Gian, then? 50-50. Vitaly said, almost sure it's IP because seems like he called polar bet on flop and turn, flop or turn, so his range is very strong. Right, yes, IP's range is very condensed here. He doesn't really have many hands with low equity. James said, could use midpoint of each bucket and multiply by size of that bucket to estimate equity. Nice, a more mathematical approach here. Certainly works. If we take basically what he's saying is take the midpoint of all these buckets, right? So 50 from 75 to 75, that would be 87.5. From 50 to 75, that would be 62.5. So just take that middle point and multiply by the proportion of those hands in your range. That would give you a decent estimate of villain's range, unless, for example, the distribution of those equities are much closer to one extreme. So if for example, all the best hands are like 95% equity, that estimation would not be very good, but that's probably not the case. So that mathematical approach would certainly work, okay? You don't need to use such a precise approach though. What you can do is take a look at the amount of trash in both players' ranges, okay? Because even though the other position player has a third of the best hands in your range, or a third of his range is 75+% equity, almost half of his range has 0 to 25. So it's very hard for this range to have a lot of equity because half of it is hands with very little equity. Whereas the IP player here has only 17% of hands with very low equity, and 73% of that range has middling equity, and 10% has high equity. Okay, so I'm with Vitaly here. It's very hard for that opposition player here to have more equity simply because half of his range is hands with very, very low equity here. Okay, so I think the IP player has the advantage here, but it's not going to be also very huge because the imposition player doesn't have too many hands with really, really strong equity. Okay, so let's say that IP has more, but probably not that much more. I think that's a good way of answering it. It doesn't have to be super precise, but it can show us the idea of who has more equity and what's the intensity of that advantage, right? Daniel said we have 43% trash and he only has 17. So my guess that IP has more equity. Perfect. That's a very good and quick way to see which player has more equity here, okay? Simply because half of this range here is very low on equity. What about EV? Gia answered very quickly that OP should have more EV. Do you guys agree with him? Do you guys think that this is a correct way of estimating EV here? And if not, why is that? Is it definitely OP who can capture a larger portion of the pot here? OP higher EV as realize his equity more. Well, there's a lot of things packed into that sentence, right? Why are you assuming that OP realizes his equity more or realize his best equity more? Dalton Lemos said, I think a lot of the equity from the IP will be denied. Interesting thought there. Yes, OP with more EV due to premium hands advantage. Nice. You guys all have the right ideas here. The OP here has a very strong nut advantage, right? It has way more of the strongest hands here than the AP player. It has a lot of air, so basically we're gonna play big bet or check, as you guys are saying. And when that happens, what ends up happening for the AP player is that the bluff catcher's equity get denied. Those are gonna face very large bets from bluffs, and they're going to get bluffed quite a lot of the time. Okay, so because of that, the equity from these hands here are gonna get denied. and this increases the EV of the out of position player. Okay, so for sure, the out of position player is going to have the highest EV. Also, you can think of it as a function of the strongest hands. Generally, are the strongest hands that drive the EV of the range, right? Middling hands and trash hands, they don't have much EV in themselves. Most of the EV comes from realizing the equity of the strongest hands. And since this range has 3 times more of those hands than this range, then naturally, it should be the case that OP has more EV here. Okay, so I agree with you guys also that OP has more EV. You get folds with polar range. Nice. That is exactly the case. So IP is going to get bluffed a ton here, and this decreases the realization of the bluff catchers. That's why you never want to have a capped range when you have a lot of bluff catchers, okay? If you have a lot of bluff catchers in your range and somehow you end up capping your range, then the EV of your bluff catchers go very quickly to 0 because now you're facing a lot of big bets from a range that is placing a lot of thin value bets against you, which allows villain to bluff even more. So your bluff catchers cannot do anything about it. They're going to get bluffed a ton by a balanced range, and then they don't ever get to showdown, and they don't ever get to realize the equity that they have against the other position weakest hands. They just always get bluffed by those hands. So that's why you never want to have a capped range when you have a lot of bluff catchers. Okay, so nice. I think you guys are very good with your answers so far. Now let's try to answer the final question, which is what spot and line is this? And to help you guys with this answer, I'm going to show you this second screenshot, which shows amount of combos, equity, and EV for both players. So here, you guys are correct. The opposition player makes more EV, and the opposition player has more equity. So we were correct here with our estimations. And we also have the information of the combos in each player's range. So based on this information here, combos, equity, and EV, what spot and line do you guys think this is? VYT said 3-bet pot river. Don't know. Gian said the line is definitely check, check, flop. Check, check, flop. I don't know, man. I don't know. It's rare that you would have a check, check, flop where OP is so polarized, right? Vitaly said single raised pot turn after overbet flop. Nice. Stewart said cutoff versus big blind, single raised pot maybe. But what line? You have to figure out the line as well, right? Casper said OP 3-bet pot, check, check, flop. You know, it's hard for a check, check, flop to produce this equity distribution, right? In which situations you're going to have a check, check, flop producing such a polarized distribution for the OP player? Someone said a few minutes before that this really looks like OP bet very large on the prior street. And I agree with that assumption, because if OP bets very large on the flop, for example, this can certainly produce this kind of equity distribution. If there is no betting going on prior streets, it's very hard to produce such a polarized distribution for the OP player. So my first assumption looking at this range is that some big bets have gone in the prior streets. Okay, it's almost the only way to produce such a polarized distribution here. Big blind versus button, check, raise, flop, and we get to the river with 9865. Check, raise, flop is a decent estimation as well, because when you check, raise, flop, especially if it's a board where you should polarize, you're gonna have a very polarized distribution, and IP is gonna mostly have bluff catchers. So that's a decent guess. Gian said it is like a flush draw flop, and then lower flush gets there on the turn, but IP has a lot of ace high flush draws. Well, generally, if the flush draw gets in, then OP is not going to be very polarized, right? So when the flush draw comes in, a lot of draws improve, and a lot of air also improves to draws. So generally, what the flush draw cards does is it depolarizes both ranges. Okay, when the flush card comes, the strongest hands, they decrease in equity because now they lose to flushes. So hands like sets and two pairs decrease in equity. Some of your air is going to increase in equity because now it picks up a flush draw. And then both ranges are going to have some percentage of nuts as well. But generally, what flush card does is it depolarizes the ranges. Okay, that's why you almost never see many big bets on flush completing cards because they naturally depolarize both ranges. James said, button big blind, check, bet small, raise. Okay. All right, a lot of different answers here. You guys are missing some piece of information that can really help you arrive at this conclusion, right? Which is the amount of combos. By taking a look at the amount of combos in both players' range, you can therefore estimate better which spot we're talking about. For example, by taking a look at this amount of combos, I immediately discard the 3-bet pot, any 3-bet pot situation. Okay, because you're never gonna see a 3-bet pot where IP has 180 combos. That's a lot of combos, okay? You're never gonna see a 3-bet pot where IP has 180 combos. So basically 3-bet pot is discarded for me. There's no way both ranges can have this many amount of combos. This looks like single raise pots. In single raise pots, we're gonna be able to have these combos. And then you guys are missing the size of the pot. By taking a look at the EVs and summing the EVs, you can know the size of the pot, okay? Because you can never win more than what is in the pot. So basically, the EV here of the sum of the EVs is 11 plus 9.4, and this is 20.4. So the pot size in this node is 20.4 blinds, okay? Both players cannot win more than what there is in the pot. So basically here we